Films evolve through the creative process, sometimes most dramatically in the editing process. It's often difficult to reconcile the difference between what we desire and what we achieve. So were there any particular scenes in Hell and Back Again that you had to construct and or reconstruct while editing to achieve the social critique that is embedded in the film?
Yeah, I think it was an evolution of my ideas evolving from a very naive idea that I think was mostly informed from fiction Hollywood movies of war. That it was this heroic, adventuresome, where a boy became a man, where it's this idea of testing yourself. And through the years of covering war, radically changed my ideas of war and what it was. It was pain and suffering. And so in the editing process, I tried to be cognizant of those representations of war that media generally feeds us. And I wanted to build on some of those cinematic techniques that Hollywood used and bring them to documentary and work in a space between documentary and fiction, and applying these really filmic techniques that you could do with this Canon 5D Mark II, very soft depth of field, moving tracking shots that are very smooth, no narration, but still have it completely true footage. And so the editing process, we had about 100 hours of footage, and really with the help of Fiona, my editor, who just was so adept at pulling the threads of the characters and the story and weaving them together. And so, at the very beginning, I remember having discussions with Fiona of what I thought the film was about, and it ended up being something totally different. So I think I learned just being very open to what presents itself, and not trying to put too much of my own maybe false representations, or at least being aware of what my false representations were, to create something that was more honest and true to what happened.
Okay, so you talked about Fiona, who teaches at Bar, and she said that she's committed to illuminating perspectives that are often underrepresented in mainstream media, and loves to craft nuanced, emotionally resonant stories about complex social issues, like war, PTSD, exactly what the film was about. Did you find that having an editor with this background, like in anthropological issues and editing, impacted the final cut of the film, given its content and commentary? You spoke to this a little already, but what specifically did she help you with? Because I know as a filmmaker, it's really great to have one other person at least to bounce ideas off of.
Yeah, so I knew of Fiona's work, Rocket Fragments, and the beautiful poetic form of that film really spoke to me. Very visual, pacing was slow, and really let the characters breathe and not enforce an agenda. Just simply, this is how it is. So I think absolutely that working with Fiona with that social justice background, we were able to craft something that went deeper than a traditional view of war. It's not just the battlefield. It is that psychological re-entry into a civilian world, and that's often more difficult for these men and women coming home from war. So I think having her background allowed this deeper investigation of what is the reality of war, what is it psychologically, emotionally, and how can we explore that, and how can we weave that. So a lot of it was me just talking to her about my own experiences of what I saw, what I felt, and helping interpret that through images and audio. So ideas like emotional numbness of when coming back from such horrific events, the only way to deal and insulate yourself from that is your body and mind becomes numb to it. And how that felt was very hard to convey in images. And so audio was actually a way that I was able to draw that out, and I would take sounds that were recorded in the field, like machine gun fire or someone crying, and I would slow them down to 2 and 4%. These low drones were somewhat similar to what I was feeling and what I think many others feel. So I was taking my own personal experiences, finding creative ways, and Fiona was the one that would put them together and take the ideas I was having and be able to weave them in a coherent way. Very abstract things, very first-person subjective experience that are very hard to communicate. She was able to pull those out very gently and very carefully, and weave it in a way that an audience could understand in a cinematic form.
Yeah. Did you find it hard to be on, like in a war zone as a person with an activist background? Because you said your parents met like an anti-Vietnam War rally, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And so having that kind of parenting and background yourself, how is it to be like put in that environment?
Yeah, I wasn't allowed to watch really violent movies, and so it was absolutely a huge shift to be embedded with the military. But I think I took the same approach that I did with any other documentary subject, and just making them feel comfortable and building trust. And I think, I came in probably with again, that kind of predetermined notion of what the images I was looking for to match previous generations of war photographers. This is a picture of war. But I think by being able to be empathetic for even soldiers that are doing the killing, and realizing that they're just part of that machine, they're a part of this institution, and it doesn't really come down to them. They are part of this conflict, and they suffer as well, and their families suffer. It's part of something that's much bigger than just the people. So being able to extend empathy to soldiers to the point where to really understand what is it that they go through. So it took a shift of my own kind of thinking of just straight black and white representations to, well, it's much, everyone part of the process is affected. And I didn't answer it in the Q&A, but I'm sort of thinking of it now, and the workers in these slaughterhouses, it's the same thing. They're the ones doing the killing and the gutting, but it's not their fault. It's really not, it's not them, it's the whole system. It's the whole system that forces them to be there in these really grueling, dangerous jobs where they're sustaining incredible injuries, exposed to incredible trauma, and they're just another victim of a larger system.
Okay, so Talon Magazine contains a scene in which imagery of the main character in combat on the battlefield. I'm sorry, I needed my glasses. Talon Magazine contains a scene in which imagery of the main character in combat on the battlefield abruptly cuts to the same character in the parking lot back home after his tour of duty. The contrast is jarring. To this end, how were particular editing techniques and devices, cutting, sound, design, color, etc., used to influence the viewer's perception of PTSD, perhaps even garnering empathy towards the end?
And I guess you could also loop in the VR as the empathy machine you're talking about.
So I was really exploring the idea of a first-person subjective experience. What does it feel like to be there? What does it feel like to come home? And the parking lot scene in particular was one that I felt was quite poignant because it was so mundane. It's just this everyday experience. But it can seem even more challenging and more complex than the simple everyday life of being at war. It's sleep, walk, fight, do it again. And that simplicity you get used to it. You get into a rhythm of it, even though it is very tough and difficult and hard. It can be simpler than relationships and bills and parking lots that are full. And so by contrasting those two worlds just side by side and using sound again to weave it, but even color saturation, having scenes of a bright Walmart just ever so slightly desaturated, turn more gray, while the audio of gunfire and then the full vibrancy of a battlefield. It's trying to get closer to what it's like to be in the psyche of a soldier and be not just there, but within their view. And so VR is an extension of that, of trying to get closer to someone else's experience. I want to understand what you've seen and what you've been through. What did it feel like? And we have these mediums. We can speak about it. We can write about it. We can take pictures. But they're all imperfect mediums of trying to communicate that inner subjective experience that only I have, but I desperately want to share with someone else. And technology is just a way to connect these lines.
And you talk about, in your lecture, you talked about having empathy classes or learning tools to understand what you're looking at in the VR headset, or just what you're experiencing when you're in that medium that we're not used to at all as a culture or anything, because it's brand new. Yeah. I loved what you said about the film has had 100 years to get perfected, and we've only had 3 with VR. Yeah. And how is that notion of learning these tools to get empathy different from modes of brainwashing?
So could these technologies be potentially used for the negative aspect, the dark side?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that is a question about the inherent moral, complete lack of morals within technology. It's inert. It is just a tool, and it's up to us to infuse these technologies with what we believe to be right, to be just, to be important. And so I think absolutely any medium, whether it's a book, television, or VR, can be used for purposes of pursuit of the interests of a very few.
Right, but what are the implications of calling it reality? I think that's the difference between film and television, is that this has reality in the title. Yeah. So what are the implications of that?
Well, we're going to start responding to it like reality. Even television or even a big screen cinema, it's still information that may evoke some emotion, but we're not responding to it in the way in VR. You're having a physiological response, an emotional response, psychological response to what's happening around you, as if you were there in real life. So I think there's many questions around the ethics of what we can expose people to in VR, if it is so true in fidelity to our real world experiences. And something like a slaughterhouse is intensely graphic, and very violent. And just say that we're a fiction film. There's tremendous violence in fiction films. Any movie is just filled with tremendous violence. I don't think there is a moral justification to show that. It's for entertainment. It's for a trivial purpose. And so, I don't watch violent movies. I don't like watching war movies. I used to sort of, that's what war is. But then when I realized it was just these fabrications, false representations of reality, the violence seemed gratuitous. It was, why would I watch this for entertainment? But when the violence is true, when the violence is real, and real beings, sentient beings are being impacted, there's a moral obligation, especially if we participate in that violence, especially if it's something that we participate 3 times a day and make a decision to participate. And ignorance may be one defense. I didn't know that. But once you do know, once you've been inside a slaughterhouse and you see how animals are killed and how they suffer, and it raises that moral question within yourself, and I think that's the power of VR, is it can raise these moral inquiries of am I doing what I think is right? And do I believe in this system of violence? And if you don't, and you choose a different path, one of compassion, one of healing, then VR has had that tremendous impact. I think that's that hope, is that because we could present highly realistic, and they're not reality, they're still pixels, they're still representations of reality, but the fidelity is so good, we will need to treat them as such. It will be like, open that door and you will go into a slaughterhouse. It will be that responsibility to say, that's what's behind that door. And if it's just entertainment, it's trivial, but if it's real and if you participated, then you have an obligation to open that door and go inside and see it.
Can you talk about the ethics then of editing the VR footage? Because you showed and the fact that you had a character in the footage of the slaughterhouse, because that's a decision, and it was like interesting and meta to see them like with a camera documenting as like they were talking to the camera, the VR camera experience. And so what are the ethics behind that editing and placement of a character narrating to the screen?
Yeah, that very conscious decision to do that. We had done other pieces where there was no narration, there was no character speaking to camera. And I think those will be useful for that cinema verite experience, but there's something about direct eye contact that we respond to incredibly strongly. It just activates something to us, and very different even from looking at a flat image and here's some eyes looking at me. But when it's a person in space, in proximity to you, looking at you, it has this sense of pulling you in and creating that sense of presence that VR provides. So we wanted to have a guide, someone to take you into this really horrific world. Because if we had presented it without anyone taking you in and calmly saying, this is what you're seeing and this is what's happening. And many people said this after. They said, if he wasn't in there, Jose, the undercover investigator, I wouldn't have been able to finish it. I wouldn't have been able to get through. They would go into a scene, they would look around, find Jose, okay, he's there, I feel him, he's there, and he's there with me. And that gives the person courage to continue with this really difficult experience. So in a way, it was a way to bring people into the world, but because it's him addressing the camera and often taking choreographed routes to the camera and then away, because of the nature of the filming, you have to leave the camera, cinematographer leaves, hides somewhere, and he has to come in. It's far more choreography than hell and back again, where I tried to minimize my presence as much as possible and disappear. In this situation, I'm asking him to actually do things. So there is actually something that's changed here. This is not, this would not qualify as journalism. This would be something else. It is a new medium. We don't know what this is yet, but we're finding things that are working. And this guide that takes you into a world is working. And so we went with that, but we can't classify it quite yet as to what it is. There's certainly an advocacy component to it, but I think there's just something more basic as just personal connection and feeling you're with someone in this place that VR can provide.
Go ahead, Milan.
Okay, so
Maybe back to hell and back again.
I'm searching for a question. Okay, so what was it like filming in a war zone under constant bombardment with no weapon of your own? Was there any particular point where you feared for your own life, and how did your concept of courage play into the filming and editing of this film, Hell and Back Again?
Yeah, there are many times that I could have been killed. In the film, where there's a IED explosion, improvised explosive device, it was maybe 10 feet away from me, and an Afghan soldier had detonated it. And in this situation, I didn't know what was happening, but I knew that I was in grave danger. But I had gone into a automatic mode of just being extremely present and in a high state of concentration. And that's essentially what I've trained myself to do in very difficult situations, is to focus on my responsibility of bearing witness and documenting and operating my camera. And so a lot of that focus goes into the camera, a lot of it goes into the awareness of what is happening, but still feeling what I feel, and that fear of death is always there, but just acknowledging it's there and continuing to work is I think my form of courage. I have a technique to focus on. If I didn't have a camera, I'd probably curl up into a ball and not be able to do anything. But by having a camera, there's a strong sense of responsibility that I'm the only one here with a camera, and people need to see the reality. So I think people can train themselves to be courageous, if it's even in daily acts of I know this is right, and maybe no one else thinks this, but because I know this is right, I will still pursue it. And I think courage, beyond sort of that physical sensation of I'll run away, but I'm not going to, is also just as applicable to values and morals that are not widely accepted yet, and that you can still persevere despite maybe the ridicule or discrimination or others that have not come to your understanding of what is right and wrong. So courage, I think, can be an everyday event if you're standing up for what you believe in.
That's a good quote. Was there, okay, so you talk about having your camera giving you a sense of purpose, right? And like, you're the only person there, you have an obligation to yourself, to your sense of, to yourself and to like the American community, I guess, and the Afghan community as well, to film these events. And was there a point during the filmmaking process that you felt you needed to stop recording, or that you needed to keep recording, like both ends of that?
I was asked to stop recording in the scene where the soldier or the Marine is killed.
Yeah.
And this was one of those decisions that I had to make, in which the importance of what was happening there, the death of an American, outweighed the privacy that he's entitled to. But I did maintain his privacy by hiding his face and not revealing his face. Mm-hmm. So I think there is still a balance that one needs to reach. And so here is something where it is very sensitive. And I talked to the Marine's father, and I asked, we are planning to show this. Is this something that's all right? Mm. And he said that he didn't want to see the footage, but he thought it was important for the American people to understand the price of freedom. So there is still judgments that have to be made as to, do I not film this? Do I film this? Do I show this? And those have to be carefully weighed. And same with the death of the Afghan soldier. The questions of, would his family see this? Would it inflict more harm on his family? But that was outweighed by the sanitization of the battlefield, of where much of the actual horror of war is hidden from the public, because it's deemed does not fit some glorified version of war. So to show his body was also a very conscious decision, but to only show it for a certain length. So there are very careful decisions that have to be made around death, about showing death, the implications of it that it will have, and why it is justified to show it.
Yeah. So what, you spoke to this more in your the beginning of your lecture, but what really prompted you as a photojournalist who was already in Afghanistan, right, to start taking videos? Like, what about your experience? And like you say, you got into, you know, photography by like looking through that book and like seeing these images and only being able to take in like 10 pages at a time because they're all so loaded. And how like, do you see video as giving people more, or is it just easier for people to chew on?
Yeah, so I see photojournalism as a beautiful language, a powerful language, but I've also come to the realization that it's maybe like becoming like calligraphy, where it is something of the past, where when print and magazines and Life magazine and Newsweek, they were the window into the world. That was how people broaden their horizons. But we just have to look at the reality of how media is consumed. It's not on flipping on pages. It's on our devices, it's on our computers. And so I think it gets back to what is impactful. And if it's impactful to use another medium, another technology, then there should be nothing that holds you from the nostalgia of a previous medium. I mean, it's still to be treated with respect and reverence, and the photojournalists of the past are heroes and the reason why I've pursued it. But it has to come into play of do they change anything? And I came to the conclusion that my images were not having much impact. They were just another image of the war. And so video was a way for me to say, hey, look, this is still happening. This country is still at war. It's been at war for a decade. And when I showed the first video of it, people say, almost across the board, they would ask, is this real? Because they hadn't seen anything like it before. It had that cinematic touch to it. It had this high resolution. And when I said, yes, this is real footage, they just could not believe it. And I was seeing the impact that video was having on people. And so video was a way to sort of reinvigorate photojournalism. Maybe it's now video journalism, or maybe it's something totally different in VR, but it's the same idea that can this have more impact? And can this change people's behavior to be kinder and more compassionate and more empathetic? So I think we just have to realize the day and age that we're in and use the tools that we have, but not get too attached to those tools and say, this is the way it must be done. And because it may have had 100 years to perfect, it is more powerful now, but this is the one that's going to be how younger generations and generations beyond that have memories of our current time. And hopefully these images of factory farms and war are reminders to future generations not to repeat the mistakes that we've made.
What does it mean to have like an immersive experience?
Yeah, so I think there's an easy kind of way to place the guiding light, and it's just reality. It's how we experience the world. That's, I'm sure, different for everyone, but we all have these basic senses. We all have a way of assembling them into our mind and our brain. We don't know how that happens. We don't know how our brain does it. All we know is that I'm here, and I think you're here, and we're all having sort of a shared experience, but there's no way for me to actually go into your world. But here's something that's pretty close. Here's something that's pretty close to what I felt, what I saw, and what I heard. And that's what VR will become. It will be these memories, and they will also be live, so there'll be these sort of live experiences where you'll be able to step into someone else's reality, and the fidelity will be so good that you will feel like you're in their shoes. You will be able to have an experience as a black person, as a woman, as a soldier, as a pig, and once our horizons are expanded of what it's like to have that experience, we will, I think, be more empathetic to others that are not like us, and we're able to expand that idea of what is in my circle of moral concern and what is out. And so I think this technology is a tool to expand that sphere of moral concern to include as Einstein says, all creatures and all of nature.
And I guess my last question is, what if VR doesn't take off? What do you do then?
Yeah, I mean, I'll probably still be making films. I'll probably still be using video, and I'd probably be doing the exact same things except with existing technology. So they're just tools, they're just ways to capture emotion and convey that emotion. But if there's something else that comes along where I can just touch your finger, all of a sudden you're in my world or that of someone else's that is suffering, then I'll go to that. So there's nothing inherent about VR that I say, well, it has to be VR, but it could be something totally different. We don't know, but it does seem to be something that is very capable of generating empathy and I think compassion.
Okay. Well, thanks.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.